Keir Starmer looked the royal guard in the eye and said, "So what exactly do you guard these days? Pigeons or tourists?" He thought it was a clever jab. What he didn't realize was who he was speaking to, a Coldstream guard with for combat. Tours behind him, a soldier who had never once broken protocol. But when the guard finally replied, the entire forecourt fell silent. His words didn't just silence the moment, they exposed the Prime Minister in a way no one expected. To want to see how it all unfolded, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. The morning mist clung to the iron gates of Buckingham Palace like a shroud, and through it came the familiar rumble of the Prime Minister's convoy. Black cars with tinted windows rolled to a stop, their engines purring with the quiet authority of power. It was November 15th, 2024, and Keir Starmer was riding high in the polls. The Labour government had been in power for just 4 months, but already the spin doctors were calling it a honeymoon period that might never end. Corporal Ross Kellen had been standing at his post for exactly 47 minutes. He knew because he'd been counting not out of boredom, but out of habit. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him to mark time in small increments. It kept the mind sharp, kept you ready for whatever came next. The tourists hadn't started gathering yet. It was too early, too cold, too grey. Just the press pack. There, cameras already clicking away like hungry insects. Kellen was 28 years old, though the ceremonial uniform and the discipline made him appear older. Beneath the red tunic and the towering bearskin, he carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much. His service record was exemplary: Royal Welsh Fusiliers, 3 commendations for valour, a man who'd earned his place among the elite guards who protected the crown. But what the tourists didn't know, what the press didn't report, was that Kellen had also seen his fair share of politicians. They came and went, like seasons full of promises. Heavy with rhetoric, light on substance. He'd stood at attention while they posed for photographs, listened to their speeches about supporting the troops, watched them shake hands with veterans for the cameras before disappearing back into their armoured cars. Ross Kellen had learned to read politicians the way a soldier reads terrain, looking for the weak spots, the false ground, the places where everything might collapse. As Starmer's door opened and the Prime Minister stepped out, Kellen's trained eye took in everything. The expensive suit that fit too perfectly, the practiced wave to the cameras, the way his aides clustered around him like protective beetles. This was political theatre, and Kellen was about to become an unwilling prop in someone else's performance. The Prime Minister's approach was calculated, deliberate. His media team had positioned themselves strategically close enough to capture every word, far enough to avoid appearing intrusive. Starmer's smile was the kind that came from years of focus groups and media training, broad enough to seem genuine, controlled enough to never reveal too much. He'd been briefed on the guard's name, his regiment, even his service record. The plan was simple: a few light-hearted exchanges, maybe a question about the guard's duties, shake hands, take photos, and move on to the next carefully orchestrated moment of his day. But as Starmer drew closer, something in Ross Kellen's stillness seemed to unsettle him. The guard's eyes were fixed on the horizon, his posture rigid with military precision. He was a statue in red and gold, a living monument to duty and discipline. And perhaps it was that very stillness that made the Prime Minister reach for politicians' instinct to fill silence with words, to make the formal informal, to turn ceremony into casual conversation. "Tell me, Corporal," Starmer said, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone accustomed to being heard, "what exactly are you guarding against out here? Pigeons?" The question hung in the air like smoke. The journalists tensed, their fingers hovering over their recording devices. This was the kind of moment they lived for, the unscripted exchange that might reveal something real beneath the polish of political performance. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the gathered aides, the kind of laughter that comes not from genuine amusement, but from the desperate need to fill an awkward silence. But Kellen didn't respond. Not a muscle twitched, not an eyelid fluttered. He remained as motionless as the bronze statues that dotted the palace grounds, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the gathered crowd. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. In that silence, something shifted. The power dynamic that had seemed so clear moments before, the Prime Minister as the dominant figure, the guard as the decorative backdrop, began to blur. Starmer's smile faltered slightly. He'd expected a reaction, perhaps a small smile, maybe even a quiet "no, sir," or just "doing my duty, sir." Instead, he found himself facing a wall of military discipline that seemed to absorb his words without acknowledgement. The cameras continued to click, but now they were capturing something different, not the easy camaraderie between a politician and a soldier, but the growing awkwardness of a man who'd misjudged his audience. "Oh, come on, Starmer," tried again, his voice carrying a note of forced joviality. "Surely you can break protocol for the PM." It was then that Ross Kellen's eyes moved. Just for a second, a flick of his gaze that took in the Prime Minister's face, the gathered press, the watching aides. In that momentary glance, years of experience compressed into a single assessment. This wasn't a man who understood soldiers, Kellen realized. This was a man who understood the idea of soldiers, the political utility of their image, but not the reality of their lives. The guard's eyes returned to the horizon, but something had changed. The silence was no longer passive. It had become active, purposeful. It was the silence of a man who'd learned to measure his words, who understood that sometimes the most powerful statement was the absence of statement. Starmer's discomfort was becoming visible now. The practiced politician's smile was cracking at the edges, revealing something more genuine beneath irritation, perhaps, or embarrassment. His aides were beginning to shift nervously, their eyes darting between their boss and the immovable figure in the red tunic. The press pack sensed the change in atmosphere, like sharks scenting blood in the water. Behind the scenes, in the carefully orchestrated world of political theatre, this was not going according to script. The Prime Minister's media team had envisioned a different kind of moment, warm, human, relatable. Instead, they were witnessing something that felt dangerously unpredictable. One aide whispered urgently into his radio, asking someone back at Downing Street whether they should intervene, whether they should move the Prime Minister along to his next appointment. But Starmer, perhaps driven by pride or political instinct, wasn't ready to retreat. He'd built his career on being the reasonable voice, the man who could connect with ordinary people. A ceremonial guard shouldn't be able to rattle him. He leaned in, slightly lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a more confidential tone. But the microphones caught every word. "Christ, it's like talking to a brick wall." The words hit the air like a physical blow. The journalists froze, their training warring with their instincts. This wasn't a planned soundbite. This was the kind of unguarded moment that could define a political career. Some of them had the presence of mind to keep their cameras rolling, while others simply stared, uncertain whether they'd just witnessed a minor gaffe or a major scandal. Ross Kellen's jaw tightened. It was the first visible reaction he'd shown since the Prime Minister's approach, and it was like watching a statue come to life. The muscles in his face shifted almost imperceptibly, but to anyone watching closely, it was clear that something had struck home. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The professional soldier's mask remained in place, but behind it, something human and angry was stirring. Ross Kellen had been called many things in his life, by drill sergeants, by enemy fighters, by the voices in his own head during the darkest moments of combat. But he'd never been dismissed as a brick wall by someone who'd never worn the uniform, never felt the weight of responsibility that came with standing guard, not just over a building, but over the ideals it represented. When Kellen finally spoke, his voice cut through the morning air with the precision of a blade. "With respect, Prime Minister, I am AWOL, one that doesn't crumble when pensioners lose their heating allowances." The effect was immediate and devastating. The gathered journalists straightened as if struck by lightning. This wasn't just a guard speaking out of turn. This was a direct challenge to government policy, delivered with the kind of quiet authority that only comes from absolute conviction. The Prime Minister's face went through a series of rapid changes: surprise, confusion, and then a dawning realization that he'd just been publicly challenged by someone he'd tried to humiliate. The reference to heating allowances wasn't random. Just 3 weeks earlier, the government had announced cuts to winter fuel payments for pensioners, a decision that had sparked protests across the country. The policy was defended as necessary fiscal responsibility, but for many, it represented the kind of cold calculation that put numbers on spreadsheets ahead of human welfare. That a royal guard would reference it so directly, so publicly, was unprecedented. Starmer's political instincts kicked in immediately. He tried to laugh it off, to regain control of the narrative. "I assume you're referring to the welfare reforms. Those were necessary fiscal," but Kellen cut him off with the same surgical precision he'd used to deliver his first blow. My mate Carl sleeps in a car park, sir, lost his legs in Helmand. Your necessary reforms just cut his disability check by 30%. The crowd began to murmur, a low sound like distant thunder. A reporter's phone started recording, capturing not just the words but the electric tension that had suddenly filled the air. The Prime Minister's aide stepped forward, perhaps intending to intervene, but Kellen wasn't finished. You asked what? I guard against indifference, sir. The kind that lets men like Carl rot, while politicians make pigeon jokes. The story of Carl McKinnon wasn't widely known, but it should have been. He was 24 when the Eid exploded under his patrol vehicle outside Kandahar. The blast took both his legs below the knee and left him with traumatic brain injury that turned everyday tasks into monumental challenges. Carl had served with distinction in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the same regiment as Ross Kellen, and the two men had developed the kind of bond that only forms between soldiers who've shared the weight of combat. Carl's transition to civilian life had been brutal. The promised support systems were overwhelmed, underfunded, and often ineffective. He'd spent months in rehabilitation, learning to walk again on prosthetic legs that never quite fit right. The brain injury made concentration difficult, turning simple conversations into exhausting exercises. Job interviews became exercises in explaining gaps in memory, in convincing employers that a wounded veteran could still be productive. For a while, Carl had managed. He'd found work as a security guard, lived in a small flat in Cardiff, even started dating a nurse he'd met during his rehabilitation. But the cost of living kept rising, and the disability payments that were supposed to bridge the gap between his limited earning capacity and his basic needs proved inadequate. When the government announced the latest round of welfare reforms, Carl's monthly check was cut by nearly a third. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Without that money, Carl couldn't afford both rent and food. He'd tried to explain this to the benefits office, had filled out form after form, had sat in waiting rooms for hours trying to appeal the decision. But the system was designed for efficiency, not compassion. And Carl fell through the cracks, like thousands of others. Ross Kellen had found his friend sleeping in his car behind a Tesco in Cardiff. Carl had been living there for 3 weeks, washing in the store's bathroom, buying ready meals with what little money he had left. The proud soldier who'd once patrolled the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan was now homeless in the country he'd served, invisible to the same government that had once praised his sacrifice. When Kellen tried to help, Carl's pride got in the way. I'm not a charity case, Ross, he'd said, his voice thick with shame. I just need the system to work the way they promised it would. But the system wasn't working, and Carl was too proud to accept handouts from his friend. Instead, he'd moved from car park to car park, staying one step ahead of security guards and police, living in the shadows of the society he'd once protected. This was the story behind Ross Kellen's words, the personal weight that gave his challenge to the Prime Minister its devastating power. It wasn't just political opposition, it was the voice of someone who'd seen the human cost of policy decisions, who understood that statistics on government spreadsheets represented real people with real needs. The immediate aftermath of Kellen's challenge was chaos barely contained by protocol. The Prime Minister's media team huddled in urgent conference, their carefully planned schedule suddenly thrown into disarray. This was the kind of moment that could define a political career, not a policy announcement or a major speech, but an unguarded exchange that revealed something essential about character. Starmer himself seemed frozen between competing instincts. The politician in him wanted to respond, to defend his policies, to regain control of the narrative. But the lawyer in him recognized the danger of engaging further with an opponent who'd already demonstrated his ability to strike at the heart of government policy. Every additional word risked making the situation worse. The journalists, meanwhile, were experiencing the kind of professional excitement that comes from witnessing genuine news being made. This wasn't a pre-arranged press conference or a carefully staged photo opportunity. This was real conflict, real emotion, real stakes. Phones were coming out, cameras were adjusting angles, and reporters were already mentally crafting the headlines that would dominate the next news cycle. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from the crowd of onlookers who'd gathered to watch the Prime Minister's visit. Word of the exchange was already spreading through the small group of tourists and palace staff who'd witnessed it firsthand. Phones were buzzing with text messages, Social media posts were being composed, and the story was beginning to take on a life of its own. Within minutes, the first clips appeared on Twitter. The video quality was poor, shot from a distance on a mobile phone, but the audio was clear enough to capture both Starmer's dismissive comment and Kellen's devastating response. The hashtag Guardians of Truth began to trend almost immediately, accompanied by hundreds of comments from veterans, military families, and ordinary citizens who saw in the Guard's words a voice for their own frustrations with government policy. The Prime Minister's team finally managed to extract him from the situation, guiding him toward his next appointment with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from years of crisis management. But the damage was done. The story was out there, spreading through the digital ecosystem with the viral intensity that only comes from moments of genuine human drama. Back at Downing Street, emergency meetings were being called. The Prime Minister's press secretary was fielding calls from journalists demanding comment. The communications team was frantically crafting response strategies, trying to figure out how to contain a story that seemed to be growing larger by the hour. The video quality improved dramatically as professional news crews arrived at the palace. By afternoon, high-definition footage of the exchange was playing on every major news network, with slow-motion replays that captured every nuance of expression, every moment of tension. Political commentators were already dissecting the implications. Historians were drawing parallels to other moments when protocol had been breached in service of truth-telling, but the story's real power came from its resonance with ordinary people. The comments sections of news websites filled with stories from veterans who'd struggled with the system, from families who'd watched their loved ones fall through the cracks of government bureaucracy, from citizens who'd felt unheard by politicians, who seemed more interested in photo opportunities than in genuine engagement with the issues that mattered. Ross Kellen, meanwhile, had returned to his duties with characteristic professionalism. He stood at his post for the remainder of his shift, seemingly unaffected by the storm swirling around him. But those who knew him well could see the subtle signs of tension, the slightly tighter grip on his rifle, the more rigid posture, the way his eyes seemed to focus even more intently on the horizon. The palace hierarchy was dealing with its own crisis. A royal guard breaking protocol to challenge a prime minister was unprecedented in modern times. Emergency meetings were called, disciplinary procedures were reviewed, and senior officers debated the appropriate response. But there was a complication. Public opinion was overwhelmingly on Kellen's side. The hashtag Guardians of Truth had evolved into something larger than a simple social media trend. It had become a rallying cry for people who felt their voices had been ignored by the political establishment. Veterans organizations were issuing statements of support. Military families were sharing their own stories of struggle with government, bureaucracy. Even some conservative MPs were privately expressing admiration for the Guard's courage. The government's response, when it finally came, was predictably cautious. A statement from Downing Street spoke of respecting all perspectives and valuing the service of our military personnel. But the carefully crafted language couldn't hide the fact that the Prime Minister had been publicly embarrassed by someone he'd tried to humiliate. The story took on new dimensions as investigative journalists began digging deeper into the issues Kellen had raised. The case of Carl McKinnon, the disabled veteran sleeping in car parks, became a symbol of the broader problems with the welfare system. News crews tracked him down, and Carl's story, told with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his military service, put a human face on the statistics that government officials had been citing to justify their reforms. The interview was devastating in its simplicity. Carl sat in his car, the backseat filled with the possessions that represented his entire life, and spoke about the gap between political promises and lived reality. "They tell you that if you serve your country will take care of you," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "But when you need that care, when you're at your lowest point, the system treats you like a number on a spreadsheet." The human cost of policy decisions was becoming impossible to ignore. Other veterans came forward with their own stories, creating a narrative that went far beyond a single confrontation at a palace gate. This was about the fundamental question of how a society treats those who've sacrificed for its protection, about the gap between rhetoric and reality in government policy. Ross Kellen himself remained silent, adhering to military protocol even as the storm swirled around him, but his silence was as powerful as his words had been. He'd said what needed to be said, had spoken for those who couldn't speak for themselves, and now he was returning to his duty with the same quiet professionalism that had made him an effective soldier. The political implications were becoming clear. The Prime Minister's approval ratings, which had been climbing steadily since the election, began to slip. The opposition seized on the moment, using it to highlight what they saw as the government's callous approach to social welfare. Parliamentary questions were tabled, demanding explanations for the cuts to disability benefits and the broader impact of welfare reforms. But perhaps the most significant development was the grassroots movement that began to form around the Guards. Challenge. Veterans groups organized rallies, military families shared their stories, and ordinary citizens began to demand better treatment for those who'd served their country. The Palace Guard had become an unlikely symbol of resistance to government indifference. The government's attempts at damage control only seemed to make the situation worse. When a junior minister suggested that the Guard had been inappropriate in his comments, the backlash was immediate and fierce. Military veterans flooded social media with their own stories, creating a narrative that painted the government as out of touch with the realities faced by those who'd served. The Prime Minister himself was forced to address the issue during a scheduled press conference. His response was carefully crafted but felt hollow. "I have the utmost respect for our military personnel and their service to our country. However, I also believe that all citizens, regardless of their background, should express their political views through appropriate channels." The subtext was clear. The Guard had stepped out of line, and such behavior couldn't be tolerated. But the public wasn't buying it. The same man who'd made jokes about pigeons was now lecturing a combat veteran about appropriate channels for political expression. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Meanwhile, the investigation into Carl McKinnon's case revealed a broader pattern of problems with the welfare system. Bureaucratic delays, inadequate support services, and policies that seemed designed more to reduce costs than to help people were creating a crisis that affected thousands of veterans and their families. The individual story had become a window into systemic failures. The palace, caught between supporting its Guard and maintaining its political neutrality, issued a statement that managed to be both diplomatic and supportive, while emphasizing the importance of protocol. The statement also noted the proud tradition of service represented by the Guards and their deep commitment to the values they protect. Reading between the lines, it was clear that the palace wasn't going to throw Ross Kellan under the bus. The Guard had violated protocol, but he'd done so in service of principles that resonated with the institution's own values. The careful balance between duty and conscience that had defined his military service was being recognized, even if it couldn't be officially endorsed. The long-term impact of the confrontation began to crystallize in the weeks that followed. The government announced a review of disability benefits, though critics argued it was too little, too late. The Prime Minister's approval ratings stabilized at a lower level, suggesting that the damage to his reputation was real and lasting. Ross Kellan returned to his duties with characteristic professionalism. Though he'd become something of a celebrity among military personnel and veterans, colleagues spoke of his continued dedication to duty, his refusal to capitalize on his moment of fame, and his quiet satisfaction that his words had sparked a broader conversation about issues that mattered. Carl McKinnon's situation improved dramatically. The publicity surrounding his case led to emergency intervention from veterans' charities, and the government fast-tracked his benefit appeal. He was eventually housed in supported accommodation and received the mental health support he'd been seeking for years. While his individual story had a positive outcome, it highlighted the arbitrary nature of a system that required media attention to function properly. The broader movement that had formed around the Guards' challenge continued to grow. Veterans organizations found their voices strengthened. Political parties began to pay more attention to military issues, and the public conversation about social welfare shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. The idea that those who'd served their country deserved better treatment had moved from the margins to the mainstream of political discourse. In the end, the confrontation between a Prime Minister and a Royal Guard had become something larger than either man had anticipated. It had become a moment of truth about values, about the gap between political rhetoric and lived reality, and about the power of individual courage to spark broader change. The Guard had stood his ground, literally and figuratively, and in doing so had reminded everyone watching that some walls don't just stand, they speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. The final image that lingered in the public consciousness was of Ross Kellen back at his post, motionless and vigilant, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had returned to his duty, but something had changed. The silence was no longer passive. It had become active, purposeful, filled with the weight of words spoken and truths revealed. In that silence, accountability had found its voice.